As a founder, we're generally optimistic people, right? We believe we can change the world. As a legal expert looking from the outside, what do you think went wrong?
It's a little bit tricky because as a lawyers, our first question will be who we are playing for. Because the business on the early stages is built mostly on the gentleman agreement. So I cannot say that it doesn't work if both parties are gentlemen, but very often it appears that someone is not. I feel that the next years will be challenging. Regulations are very demanding. They require lots of compliance, which is very, very, very expensive. You need to pay lots of money for the license. You need to have a solid authorized capital of your company. You will need to have a compliance officer. If you calculate this all together, the bootstrapping startup will never, like for example in FinTech, will be never able to comply.
What are some of the most common legal mistakes that founders make that put them in trouble eventually? Hi everyone, welcome to She Talks Business, another episode from Bali. We're speaking to a legal expert today, so we're going to be diving into all the mistakes founders make across the life of a business, starting from when they start out all the way to when it becomes this mammoth enterprise. Thank you so much for joining us today, Daria.
Thank you for having me, Sana. My pleasure.
I am extremely excited to talk to you about all the legal mistakes people make when they're starting a business, running a business, growing a business. And we can start with, obviously, first just tell us a little bit about you. What have you been doing in terms of your work? How did you land where you are today?
So I'm a lawyer. My total experience is around 15 years. I was working in the large corporations as an IP lawyer. Then I moved to Bali and started working with the crypto environment and startups. And for sure, it's a completely different world after you're working in an American company where everything looks like a perfect, and also you have budget for everything. For me, it's a very interesting experience trying to adapt the best practices for the level which the founders can achieve on the early stages of building the business.
In your experience so far, what are some of the most common legal mistakes that founders make that put them in trouble eventually?
What I've seen among my clients, in general, the business on the early stages is built mostly on the gentleman agreement. So I cannot say that it doesn't work if both parties are gentlemen, but very often it appears that someone is not. And some people can lose money and reputation working with a partner who is not reliable. And unfortunately, this may happen easily. So first of all, when people partner up, and for sure they respect each other as the business partners, they don't really want to pursue any sort of agreements, because I think it's same with the marriage. I think it's very hard to present
a set of terms and conditions.
The contract. But the real life shows that before building the business, it's really good, if you don't really know the person well, is to do the preliminary due diligence and really understand better what is your partner is strong in and what is not. And this can be the ground of the potential agreements, even like a one-pager telling about the conditions and the KPIs which each of the partners should achieve to succeed in the business. For example, let's say I have the person who is the CTO, or working as a CTO, business development, marketing, some other roles. And then some person from the team shows that he or she is underqualified or underperforming. And then it's very hard to kick out the person
that you founded the business with.
that you founded the business with. But for this situation, I would say that it's pretty fair to set up some particular KPIs for any role. And this may be very, very helpful as a baseline of the relationship within the founders team.
Right. If we were to talk in terms of the cycle from start to beginning, what are some reasons, in your opinion, as a legal expert, why somebody should start early in terms of setting up the right legal structures and so on and so forth?
First of all, it's always cheaper to do everything more or less okay from the beginning, because then you are more secure in force majeure events. And lots of legal job is about the prevention of the different force majeures. So unfortunately, our job is to think about the potential problems. And that's why this is what we focus on when we're trying to prevent this to happen. Having like a company in the right jurisdiction may help a lot in terms of regulatory risks for the risky business. Having some papers with a key team in place helps to maintain the team or potential problems and help to manage the people, especially if you have the superstars in the team who potentially can pivot, for example, and go to the company who your direct competitor or do something else. For sure, it's wise to have all sort of agreements put down in the paper, things like that. Also, on the stage of attracting the investments, investors will always request the particular amount of papers. When we talk about the IP, like all the contracts, like it's the specifics of this law, but like license agreements and assignment of IP should always be done in the written form. Because otherwise the company may produce something, and then the people who, for example, were working, they can claim that they never assigned the rights to what they created. For example, if they see that the value of what is created is way higher than, for example, the potential salary that they were getting. And then you can see this type of risks.
A lot of the legalities really start to show when you raise investment. So I think it might be helpful for any of the founders who are in the process of fundraising or otherwise to know what are the different instruments available to them, and also the different documents, perhaps, starting from, let's say, the term sheet itself. What are some things for them to actually look into in terms of, is this favorable for me and not? And then what are some of the other instruments and documentation that they might come across when they're raising funding for their startup?
Sure. So the term sheet is, first of all, is the soft agreement. And normally it's not non-binding, but it's a very important document for any sort of further deals, because there you can find all the key requirements from both sides. So you have all the numbers, but also you have normally you have all the specific requirements. And there you can see what is the real appetite of your potential investor in terms of extra rights this investor wants to get. And the common advice to the founders is, even though we all understand that raising money and when people try to raise money, they can be sort of desperate to close the deal as soon as possible. However, it's really important to be realistic and try to understand what exactly the investor wants to get. Because very often, for sure, investment firms, especially professional players, they try to get as much rights and powers as they can. Some of the firms, they prefer to become a lead investor when they also have special rights against other potential investors. And I want to say that it's bad if this particular investor you can see as your potential partner, and this sort of like a smart money who can help you to grow the business. And if not, the recommendation is just to be balanced. As I used to say to the founders, if you really believe in your project in the long term, you really need to think about the potential consequences in the long term, because for sure we all know that the success rate is not that high, but still any founder will succeed only if he believes that he will be the one. And then you need to be realistic, and maybe to consult with any lawyer and to give them and to get the understanding what the particular provisions means, because from what I see, even founders who has experience and who invest themselves, they often don't really understand the meaning of the papers. They just see that all their friends and like the whole market have this sort of the trend. Everybody do this. This is similar to this, but often they don't bother to make a specific analysis just to understand what is the document about, what are the consequences, and how it's applicable for their particular business models.
Absolutely. I think that's super important, right? Because for every business model, different things would work.
Exactly. And the different sort of investor, because I do believe that the best thing you can get is the strong partner with the experience in your, like, as your investor.
Yeah.
And then it may be fair maybe to give the rights, for example, like anti-dilution or pro rata rights for the investor to buy more shares in the future rounds. If it's someone who's gonna support your project and you really want to come with this investor together, right, and to grow big, and it can be fair, but it can be sometimes it can be like not fair, because you can see the examples of the term sheets where on default the investor of the early round try to get, let's say, more than 50% of the voting power of the company, which means that the founding team will lose this ability to manage the company on default. On the stages when the company is already does exist, the investor and the product, for example, already sort of ready, sometimes people who successfully bootstrap to this stage, they can go directly to the more classic and risk-free for the investors instruments like share subscription agreements in any form, which means that you're just selling the shares, existing shares, and in the moment of payment, people will get equity directly. It can be done also from the legal perspective, like just top up to the authorized capital to give the new capital to the investor and things like this. But for sure now, for the early stage companies, the most popular will be SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity. And everybody knows about this instrument, but unfortunately not everybody really understands it super well. I would say that in general it was introduced by the Y Combinator, and this is a simple instrument which is pro founders, and that's why it became so popular. Because the specific of this instrument is that basically if the startup doesn't reach the success, the investors doesn't really have any grounds to get the money back. So the main difference of SAFE from, let's say, from the convertible note, that it's not a loan. It's just people buying the right to get the future equity in the particular trigger event. So if the trigger event doesn't happen, the SAFE cannot be converted, and that's why this particular instrument it's a more pro-founder one. Another important thing about SAFE is that why people use it so much, because it doesn't really require the company valuation. I mean, this like a particular like audited company valuation, because that's why people use it on the early stage, because the instrument which are given there is like a valuation cap, but basically people just calculate the percentage of the ownership which they want to give away and the amount of money they want to raise, and based on that they put these amounts, but there is no need to prove the valuation of the company anyhow. But if we're talking about equity, there are only like two options. It's either direct equity or future equity, like the promise to give the equity in the future. The main difference, I would say, that if you will see the share subscription agreements, normally this sort of document already contain all the terms related to the potential corporate rights which the investor wants to get, and this should be done together with a shareholders agreement, and the articles of the company should comply, and there already can be the provisions about the management of the company, about their right, for example, to appoint a director to the board of directors and things like that. That's why this instrument will works better for a more mature business.
Right.
Where the people are ready to think how they're going to manage the business, how many people will be in the board of directors, who they want to allow to this board of directors, and things like that. Then there are debt instruments where the debt can convert into equity. There can be some other debt instruments where, for example, the investor granting the company a debt, and later there are conditions how this debt should be paid out, for example, with the right to get some percentage from the future returns or profits made by the company and things like this. And
so revenue based.
Yeah, it can be a revenue based or some, but I think it's not very common for the IT and a crypto space, because I think it makes more sense for more predictable and traditional areas of business.
Right.
Yeah, but the other one, which I think it's important to talk if we are still talking more about the crypto and technological company, is the tokens. Because
that I have no idea about, so I'd love to know what those instruments are.
So apart from SAFE, I'm sure you know that there is a SAFT.
Yeah.
It's a simple agreement for future tokens. It's
yeah.
also the investor gives you the money and you promise to deliver a particular amount of tokens after the token generation event. So it works exactly like SAFE, just with the tokens. But the other one, which is getting more popular now, is a token warrant. And what founders sometimes don't really understand, that the token warrant is just the right of the warrant holder to buy the tokens at the particular price in the future, which means they can buy and they cannot buy.
Right.
Yeah. So as for now, I would say that the most common deal is SAFE plus token warrant, where the investors grant the particular percentage of equity with a particular percentage of tokens. Like, for example, if the investor will hold, let's say, 5% of equity, he can be allowed to buy, let's say, 5% of all tokens, or some percent of the tokens which will be allocated for the company and management team. Sometimes people think that if they have SAFE with a token warrant, that they can choose what the investor will get. And this is also not very true. And that's why I say that founders should be very accurate when they decide to go to any investments, because if people don't really understand the meaning and their future obligations, they can be surprised.
As founders, we're generally optimistic people, right? We believe we can change the world, right? And so we're not really thinking something's going to go wrong till something does go wrong. And they've gone wrong with the smartest people who've built large companies and so on and so forth. And I think Steve Jobs is the perfect example of things going wrong for him, that he was fired and so on. What do you think went wrong? What did he do wrong? Could it have been avoided?
I think it was the lack of trust, and some founders cover themselves from the beginning. And here, if you look at these cases, and for example, we compare him with Mike Zuckerberg and Facebook. So in his case, they have this dual share structure, which means that different series of shares can have different rights. So, for example, Mike Zuckerberg was focused on holding his control of the company. That's why, if I'm not mistaken with the numbers, but with the ownership of only 16% of ownership, he was holding more than 70% of voting power. Which basically means that investors agreed in the way of buying the shares with the less voting power. that this person will remain in control of the company. And he proved it with the success of buying the Instagram, like as an example. And the other founders who doesn't really protect their right to manage the company with presenting this dual shares structure, they can lose the power, because if there is a board of directors and their voting power is less than 50%, let's say, then the professional players can doubt that the founder is the one who is ready to manage the big, large corporation. Because what is often happening is that the founders, their projects are appreciated, but when the company really grows and it comes from 10, 15, 20 people to hundreds of people, the investors, they often can doubt the skills of the founder, because the goal is very different and the type of work is very different.
Absolutely. The role is completely different, right? The founder's job is different from the CEO of a larger enterprise.
Yeah, because what is happening in the beginning, from my personal perspective, is that the founders in the beginning, they are basically into the product.
Yeah,
they are the soul, look and feel, technical aspects, but it's about the product. But when you're managing the large corporation and there are already tons of people, then you already need to understand about finance, about the general management, about the accounting, how to read the numbers. Yes, like always, the famous book about Nike. Yeah, it's like when the author is speaking that like understanding the accounting is the key for your successful business as a sustainable big corporation. And yeah, I think this is the main reason. So, and here we have different examples. Like some founders are fine with that and they take the role, they can step down from the CEO role and stay in the company and, for example, remain as the head of the innovations or the head of the product, head of creative. So it really depends.
Or they just move to the board and sort of no longer participate in the day-to-day.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in the history we can find all examples.
At an early stage in the business, incubators and accelerators have a very important role to play. Are there legal structures, like are there legal consequences that accelerators or incubators can face based on how they're supporting startups or whether they take equity in those startups? Are there any interesting legal structures that they should follow?
Normally, incubators, they as far as I see, they do this like acceleration project, like programs. And then they do this like pitch day, and maybe they can allocate some grants to the winners, or they can invite the potential investors who will want to invest directly. But if you're talking about the structuring, one of the interesting ideas was exactly to structure it through the Marshall Islands DAOs. So Marshall Islands are interesting because they took a legal system very similar to what is built in Delaware law. So it's super flexible in terms of options how to structure the business. And so what they allow now is that to create some master DAO, and this is free, which is very important. you can register the sub DAOs, like a serious DAOs. It's like same like a serious LLC in United States. And the interesting idea which I saw is that incubator can create this master DAO for themselves, and then they can do this small series sub DAOs for their potential project to give them at least some legal shell. And what is good about these sub DAOs is that according to the law, it's basically a separation of the assets. So for this sub DAO, you can allocate the separate treasury and the separate management team. So if there is an incubator who really working with the people on the very, very early stages, and especially if they want to invest some money there, I think it can be a very interesting structure, because it will still give some level of control, let's say, for the incubator. because for sure these sub-DAOs are more or less dependent from the master DAO, so it's not like fully separate. But on another hand, from the regulatory perspective, it already gives some safety for the team.
I'm interested and curious, you made that transition from this really large organization to working with startups and founders here and then the crypto space. What are some of the most interesting things that you've worked on that we can learn from as founders and entrepreneurs and investors?
From the psychological side, like people don't really like lawyers. What I always try to say that we don't try to piss off founders, we try to help. Just it's our work to warn them about the potential risks, but it's not because we don't believe in the project or something. It's just because unfortunately people very often come to us or when it's already too late. When everything is already ruined, people decide to come to the lawyers. And the other thing is often you cannot, like as a lawyer, you cannot do many things by your own because you need the commercial view or you cannot put the numbers yourself. You cannot calculate all risks because you don't really know the business that well as the founder. When it comes to money, people can become ruthless, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because very often all the gentlemen's agreements, they work only in this very early promising stage.
Yeah. Not when there's more at stake. Yeah, when there's money involved. Like initially, there's usually not a lot of money involved. So you feel like it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But that's why all these sophisticated legal structures, they basically what they do, they try to find this like a balance which will work for everyone. Like, for example, option programs, which should be, because very often, like if we're talking about the serious startups, they create the option programs, which means that the founders will have this like a 3-5 years period during which then the shares of the company are going to be vested to them as well. And this is very important because it, first of all, it shows that the people are committed for the long term. And on another hand, it's giving the guarantee for the investors that the founders won't run away or they won't get the money and go.
And there can be consequences.
And there will be consequences and they won't get the shares of the company unless they really fulfill their 3 to 5 years of hard work, which they promise when they pitch.
And if, let's say, I want to invest in a company, I want to understand if this is a good option, if they've covered themselves legally, and I wouldn't get into legal trouble. Are there specific things that I should be looking at?
Well, for sure, the due diligence should be done. Normally, when people negotiate, and if we're talking about the serious M&As, there could be provisions covering the risks. Like one sort of scenario can say that if one party did the due diligence and find that everything is good, they cannot file any claims after against this due diligence because they presume that they could know about all the potential, not force majeures, but weak sides of the business. For example, losses like lawsuits, potential risks, loss of profit or whatever. This is one concept. Another concept is that people can do some particular due diligence, but they still want to have some guarantees. For example, they do an M&A, and this is a more interesting example because then already company have some history, and they normally have things to hide.
Right.
And then they want to increase the price, so they want to show their piece of pie the most beautiful and like tasty for the potential buyer. But then the potential buyer, normally they will put some warranties, and for example say that in 1 year of running the business, if for example some warranties or something which cannot be found out during the due diligence or there were any misrepresentation, they can request the other not fulfill the full payment if the payment is not done in advance, or they can ask some money back. Yeah, for example, if they were assuming that they're buying the business with this sort of valuation, and then they found out that something goes wrong. And this is, I think it's very interesting to read some case studies about these deals on these more mature stages, because it basically gives the more, when the more money is involved, the example is more bright. And then when it goes for the founders, I think that the background check of the people will be important, because for sure there are many serious founders, but there are like people who just like for sure fail because it's hard to succeed. And there are some serial scammers as well, right? So for example, if you see that in the team there is a person who was only always participating in the scam project, I think it should be a red flag. And honestly, my recommendation not to become a bad example is just to spend either a couple of days or go to any sort of incubator which always have the advisors around them, and just find the resources, get this like a free packages of these papers which are already drafted for all this. Like you can go online and you can see package for founders, package for, I don't know, tech company. And then even if it won't be perfect fit for your case, it will be something. And it won't cost you much.
So, I mean, there can be little things that you can start with without having to incur a lot of
Yeah,
cost.
you can do it.
But there's also a lot of misinformation, right? If I go and look up misinformation, but also just too much information, which might not be easy for me to understand. So let's say if you were to start a business today, what are some of the things that you would put together? And then let's say when you were starting to raise funding, what are some additional things that you would put in place?
Investors will want to see this incorporation documents, maybe audit of your code, these contracts with your development team, which means that the things which they do develop is yours. And in these contracts, I always recommend to put the particular, let's say, GitHub accounts and say that everything which is transferred here is mine. Yeah, and like use this classic system of the corporate accounts for your team, corporate emails, because then it's very easy to prove that this particular activity was done for your project and for your IP, because you don't have an IP if you don't have these papers. And yeah, and then just choose your instrument which you want to raise with. For sure, if there is a trend on the market, I think it's a bit hard to go against the trend and create something very creative. So yeah, my advice would be to be, first of all, realistic about your project, because what we see now is a lot of over evaluation of the projects. And for sure, when the time goes tough, it's harder to raise. And I think that if your project is pretty like small and it's not the project which can be scaled for millions and millions of dollars, you need to be fair with yourself, and you don't need to over evaluate your project, because then it will be hard to raise.
Yeah, I think we've seen that in the past couple of years with valuation skyrocketing.
Exactly.
In 2021, 22, and then, funding going dry, and then valuations, future rounds being harder to raise.
I feel that the next years will be challenging.
Why do you say that?
Because the regulation getting more tough, especially in the developed, let's say, jurisdictions. So for sure, we all hope that Donald Trump will bring some bloom in the US and that there will be more legal freedom, let's say, for the crypto business in states. However, we need to remember that, like, in the end of December, MiCA should be in place in Europe. Like, I was just recently speaking with a lawyer who is working in an association which is focused on this European laws and MiCA regulation. And she said that in reality, most of the countries are not ready. So the real instruments are not ready, and it's not obvious how it's going to be implemented. And it seems that in coming 2 years, nothing going to work on one hand.
But what are the challenges? Like, why are countries not ready?
Challenges are that the regulation are very demanding. So they require lots of compliance, which is very, very, very expensive.
For instance?
So, to work under the licensed areas of business in Europe, it means that you need to pay lots of money for the license. Then you need to have a solid authorized capital of your company. And then you need to implement the particular, like the same, like AML, like KYC, whatever systems, compliance, to have a people hired with a particular qualifications, which you need. For example, you will need to have I don't know, compliance officer, officer for this, officer for that. And normally these people who are licensed in Europe will cost you a lot. And if you calculate this all together, it gives like, it obviously shows that the bootstrapping startup will never, like, for example, in FinTech, in the area of FinTech, will be never able to comply.
Right.
Himself. So for me, it seems that every country, they basically copy many things from each other, but all of them trying to implement lots of local requirements. And when every country has a local requirement, it means that every country where you're going to work, for example, if you have a client from the particular country, which maybe it's not the country of your incorporation, but if you're serving the clients in that country, potentially you have the regulatory risks.
Right.
Because, for example, if your activity requires a license, in the perfect, like a legal world, you need to have a license in every country of the world, right? Where you want to work, for example. And we don't know how it's gonna be, but everybody wants money and everybody wants taxes. So I think that in coming years for Europeans, it will be very challenging because they are super restricted from the markets because of these compliance reasons and the huge fines, which normally introduced by European countries. Then the next step is the risk that the App Store and Google Store may delist the apps which don't have the license in these sort of jurisdictions. So, for example, if you have your application for, let's say, wallet with a swap, something functionality, and like even if you are not making the swap directly, but you're using some exchange, like it's with a very high probability without the license in some time, like Apple Store may be pushed by the local regulators, for example, to delist all these apps for European territory, as an example.
Are there any jurisdictions where this has worked successfully so far?
There are jurisdictions which are preferable for sure, but the problem is that most of the projects, they are global. Most of the crypto tech projects, they normally targeting global audience.
Right.
And that's why there are always these like spots of freedom, spots which are where people have to block the services, and it's really challenging to give the particular advice to the founders, because if you all say that from the super legal perspective you need to have a license in every country in this world,
Yeah, that's
you can expect what the founder will tell you back.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, this is the reality. So I think that this, like a bull run we see in this, like last years, there is this boom of DeFi and FinTech, and PSPs and things like that, lots of projects. But it's obvious that there will be the peak of this, and then probably the regulators will start to cut. Like, for example, recently I read the news about Canada, where there are lots of companies with these like MSB licenses, and there was some investigation against it was around some exchange which were serving like Russian stuff, and they found out that there are, like, let's say 200 startups registered on the same address. So from this news you can say, probably in Canada now people will gonna be in trouble, because probably they will revoke lots of licenses, and after this scandal and this big investigation which was done, probably Canada now will be challenging. And this is an ongoing process.
Right. And I think that would be true for any nascent technology that that comes up, right? Where legal frameworks aren't existing at present, and then there's going to be so generally, like, do you think there's still hope? Like, what would you tell all these founders who are working in this space? What should they look out for? How can they protect themselves? How can they still run their businesses?
The most talented will create some new hype, right? Because, like, I mean, some new innovation, which will be something new, which we don't think about today, and then it will be the next trend for sure. Someone will be talented and just create something new again.
Yeah, I think, but there's also, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, it goes back to there are different kinds of frameworks that work for different kinds of business models. And then what you're trying to achieve, which is why some sort of flexibility and options are, are always good to have.
Yeah, it's always good to have many layers as well.
Yeah.
Like, it's always good to divide your business. Not always, baby, but it's often good to divide your business in separate entities, and then you can run your parts of the business in a very different way. Like, for example, if you want to have your tokens and maybe some sort of protocol, something on chain, great, you can do it like purely decentralized, like run like with the community and all this like involvement activities. But then you need, probably, if you have some other areas of business where you're working on, you know, development of other innovations, it's really good to separate it from that.
Thank you so much. It was great to have you. And hopefully, if we have more questions, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of questions that will come to mind for people who watch the episode. So if there are more questions, we'll bug you again.
Great, thank you very much for having me.
Awesome.